there's a lot of really great groups. There's a lot of really good collaboration already happening globally with all the different networks that are out there. But within our state, kind of what was mentioned earlier in the panel with the mayor and everything was, how do we kind of capitalize off of what we're doing if we collaborate together? How do we build awareness? How do we let the state and politicians and all of that know what we're doing? And how do we all work together and benefit from that? So what does that look like? So one of the things Sean and I have been talking about too, and I've talked to Alex and a lot of different people about this idea of like a Pennsylvania Coworking Alliance. So you do see alliances throughout the country. I know Seattle has one. There's a couple other ones, but Pennsylvania really doesn't have anything official. I mean, it's more kind of just loosely. Some of us are working together. Adam from Startup and stuff are good partners. So what does that look like? What's the interest? Pulling from this panel's knowledge of how they've collaborated with co-working spaces before, what could be the benefit? So just to kind of get started, so we all say co-working is about community collaboration, and sometimes we're not doing that amongst ourselves, and I'd love for that to branch out. How do we get better at connecting the movement within the state of PA? And I know that, Angel, you're not Pennsylvania, but no, I'm saying, like, how has that happened? What is your experience and knowledge would be fantastic.
I mean, it's modern storytelling, right? It's the ability to generate content that we can all mutually share to capture that unified narrative. And I think Sean has summed up what that narrative is pretty elegantly in sessions past, but we've got to figure out the systems and the process and the collaborative environment where it's just the norm to share each other's version of the story, especially when it's targeting people that can make change at a state level.
I think when we ask, like, how do we want to collaborate, right? We want to begin with the end in mind, right? We want to know what are we collaborating for? What do we want to achieve? So the 1099 versus W-2 issue is something that has not come up as intensely in our space and discussion. I think our freelance community is just younger, but is that the issue that we want to champion first, or is that one of the set of issues we want to champion first? Because I think figuring out what we want to address will help us understand, well, how much knowledge sharing do we need to have? How much discussion do we need to have between each other to agree on a position to advance before we figure out how we want to advance that?
Well, do we start as simple as even gauging what the state looks like? Like, what are the co-working spaces have? Like, who's starting? What does it look like? How many people?
So there's also an interesting layer, and I'm going to sort of think out loud a little bit here. One of my points of contention with most alliances is their operator alliances. And it's hard to have that conversation without our members being in the room. Mm-hmm. So I know that there are members of co-working spaces in this room, and I think that's good, but this is the majority owner-operator. So I think it's worth distinguishing that at the very least and making it clear that this is an operator alliance, perhaps. And I think that there's something very different about an operator alliance versus bringing our members together. That's not to say that bringing our members together is not something we should or should not do. I just think it's separate, okay? I think that one of my biggest takeaways from the conversation earlier is in line with the realization that there is power in numbers, and we represent bigger numbers than even we realize. So maybe the active collaboration, the bar is high. It requires a lot of busy people's times for an unknown outcome, and it's, whether we like it or not, political. Not in terms of state political, but people have different beliefs and expectations, and that's potentially confusing. But I think something that helps us estimate what kind of numbers we have, so when we say strength in numbers, we know what those really are. I think a presentation about having those numbers changes whatever it is that we choose to present, makes a lot of sense. So we recently started working with the Freelancers Union, which is based in New York City, who started what is quite simply an email list and resources for freelancers to entice them to join their email list. But they essentially used that number and then later that reach to create lobbying power to pass the Freelance Isn't Free law in New York City, which puts a lot of legal power and legal power and resources in the hands of freelancers who have been stiffed on jobs. And that's not just creative freelancers, that's gig workers, people who do, the guy who's trying to get this started in Philadelphia is a bricklayer. So this is, widening our scope of what an independent worker is. May not be the people who work in our spaces, but there are still lots of independent workers who aren't necessarily mobile as we think of them. And so the guy who has been coming to Philadelphia for the freelancers meetings, freelancers union meetings in Philly, is starting to organize basically the stuff that they collected in New York. Say, like, this is the stuff that was worth collecting. We're going to reverse engineer that into the stuff that we need to start collecting in Philly. And as soon as I have that, I would be very, very happy to extrapolate that to a statewide effort.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So the only way I know how to talk about alliances for co-working spaces is by telling you how I started my alliance for co-working spaces. So I was the only co-working space in my town for a little while, 6 years, I think. And so I was waiting for someone with which to alliance, because I saw Seattle's and I saw Toronto's and some other spots, and I was like, I want co-working friends and other people who know what this is. And so then in the space of about 18 months, I think 6 spaces opened. And so as they would open, I would just reach out to them and say, like, hey, I want to have an alliance. Do you want an alliance with me? I don't know what we do. I don't know what it is, but we should have an alliance. I'm like, great, yeah, let's do that. So what ours ended up being was each space pays $200 a year. And for the people who need ROI, they get a listing on our website, which is focoworks.com. And really the goal for that was, I can't believe I did this. It was a terrible business decision. But basically, if somebody Googles co-working Fort Collins, they get to Cohere because I've been around for so much longer and have so many blog posts and so much content power behind Google, that I ended up being the clearinghouse for anybody who was looking for co-working, no matter how disparate their ideals were with Cohere. And so I was spending a lot of time being the clearing, just talking to everyone about co-working, even if they were really, really, really wrong for Cohere. And so I thought, well, if I can have this aggregator site that people get to first, then they can self-select into the spaces they want to visit, or visit them all and then pick the one that's right for them, which ended up saving me a lot of time, which was a good business decision. But to intentionally say I don't want all the traffic, I just want a little bit of the traffic is a hard sell. And so that's been really beneficial because now people do multiple tours before they choose the space they want, which we love, because then they select into the one that's right for them, which saves each operator a lot of time and money, because if you onboard somebody who's wrong for you, that's so much time and attention to that person, only for them to realize that they belong in the space 2 doors down. And then they have to go through that same time and attention and onboarding at that second space. So that's been really beneficial. But then our kind of claim to fame is trying to connect our members to one another. So I disagree with Alex. You don't have to have either or, like operators versus member alliances. You can have a blend of both. So we do usually 3 large-scale events every year, and we rotate around to the different spaces. The next one coming up is at Cohere. But all of the members of all of the spaces are invited. And our big one that we do is Friendsgiving in November. So we have it at one of the bigger co-working spaces. We get some of our fun food partners to donate food. We have the food bank come in and give a little presentation on the impact that they have in our community. There's a suggested donation that goes right to the food bank. And we completely underestimated how many people would come. And so we ran out of food at our food bank fundraiser, which I mean is sort of clever, because it's like, look, wasn't that painful? Wouldn't you like to donate more money to the food bank? So we had over 100 people come, and we ran out of food in like 5 seconds, but we raised $1,600 for our food bank. And we had this All Colorado playlist playing over the loudspeakers, and so we look forward to doing that every year. But that's sort of the approach that we took. Sometimes we meet every month, sometimes we don't. We help each other with problems, like operator level problems, which is cool. But then I think what's most helpful is that if somebody comes to Cohere and they're like, I'm a photographer and this is what I need, it's like, oh my God, don't join Cohere. You should be at the Articulate, which has a fully equipped photography studio and a whole bunch of people doing what you do. Yeah. And it's like, oh wow, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, because like we're referring to other spaces all the time. Like people come through, and it's pretty obvious they need closed doors. I mean, I've sent them to Joel, who's sitting here, to Warehouse 210, other spaces that might not necessarily even think to collaborate with us, even though we're constantly referring to them. And I just think that there's a space in York that closed down that if we had known that they were struggling, because I think it was really, JJ and stuff really were doing, I think, a good job. They were just having a hard time, and I mean, we weren't really aware of the struggles they were having until it was too late. So it would be really great to be able to say, hey, we're a support network, and there is members can be involved, and founders and all of that. It is kind of like one big happy family in a way, and I know that there's logistics to that, and I might not be as a formal organization, maybe it's more loose, but I'm just thinking that like as this is growing, and those of us who are really interested in like co-working as community and not real estate development could kind of band together and potentially learn a lot from each other, but then also collaborate and or refer and network and beyond that.
So is there a belief in, there's co-working, where you can go visit another space. And
Visa program?
Yeah. That. Does everyone subscribe to that? Is it a good thing?
Yeah, I love it. Actually, that's one of my next things. Steve, you're just like, you're in my list. So one of the things I think that a lot of spaces, as all of you probably you get called or pinged a lot. Hey, I'm thinking of starting a space, or I want to start a space. Can I sit down and talk to you? Or can you send me information? And so a lot of us give of our time and resources. And the first thing I say is, have you Googled co-working, and have you actually found the co-working wiki? Because there's so much information there. And that tells you all about the Visa program, and I think the Visa program is a really good resource. So just kind of speaking to that, what resources, as people are starting spaces, or if there was an alliance and we're kind of sharing information, besides for Alex's great blog and your great book, like what are some other resources that you go to gather information, and what would you suggest? Something for us to look at as we collect that.
Yeah, so I have some go-to places online these days. The Women Who Co-Work Facebook group. You can request to join that if you've already opened a space. Anne and I are both part of that. And I think that's just a really nice, I've been really pleased by the quality of responses that come to questions that women have about how to run their space, or how to, handle members and whatnot. And I just think it's really fascinating, the depth of vulnerability that we'll see in the Women Who Co-Work group is wildly different than even how the question would be posed on the public Google group. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really powerful resource for women, where we can sort of be our true selves in that group versus how we project and interact on a mixed gender public group. The Co-working Google group is old and massive, and you can search in there for just about anything, and you'll probably find the answer to the question you have. I also enjoy greatly the Co-working Content Alliance Facebook group run by Kat Johnson. A lot of us here are part of that group, and so just a lot of support and resources for using content as a marketing tool and a way to drive people and members to your doorstep. That's a great one. And then I think just as you age in this industry, you develop a peer group that you can rely on for the really heavy stuff that you can sometimes deal with, like member suicide or member death, and maybe things that you don't want to post in a Facebook group, but you've got your trusted peers in a text message or a phone call or something. So I think it's really important to make friends, your contemporaries, who are kind of the same age as you and the same experience as you, and rely on them heavily for the really heavy emotional stuff that happens to owners and founders and community managers. I think that's been probably one of the more powerful things that I participate in, and we usually have a retreat once a year where we go away and live together for 4 days, and we just share everything, and we cry and we hug and like work it out. So I would really encourage you to try to find a trusted group of co-working operators that you can meet with annually, and just kind of resource yourself for all of the giving that we do.
I think Angel hit the vast majority of the most valuable, especially publicly accessible ones. And so I'll heartily second all of those. I mean, the only other thing that really comes to mind for me is in that interaction and relationship we're hitting up those peer groups, also just making time to get together with those people and find out what's going on in their life outside of co-working. I've definitely had some personal, professional relationships in this world atrophy because all we ever talk about is co-working. I think that's like a liability in any of our worlds, and I'm just as guilty of it as anybody else. Something I've been a little bit more aware of recently.
I would just say make sure your math works. So find a resource where you can look at these expenses you're imagining and this income that you're imagining and put that in a spreadsheet and validate that your business model is a real business model.
I mean, we hit on tons of the resources and tons of the personal interactions. I would say we've started to lay the foundation of what those resources are and could be kind of right here, right? We're exchanging business cards and contact information, and I think we'll all get that when we're done here. And we'll have that network to tap, whether that's for co-working or a personal connection with peers who at least understand our work life in the context of the rest of our lives. I think there's a challenge in creating uniform co-working resources because of the variation in our spaces. Josh, your like revenue tables and your finances are like wildly and radically different than say yours, Angel's. So it's hard to share those kinds of core resources to the business. I think we're a much more dialogue intensive support system. So I think that having those connections and I think maintaining them intentionally is critical, almost a peer mentorship group.
Got it. What does sustainable co-working look like, especially in Pennsylvania? How do we keep movement growing and sustainable? And is that, I mean, like if we operate my fear is if we operate in silos and you have a lot of real estate development that kind of comes, I mean, there's probably several spaces right now opening up in Lancaster County that are under under this cloak of co-working necessarily, and there is confusion. There's confusion between a WeWork and a space like ours or Indy Hall, that kind of thing. I think like just in the general public, not obviously within these circles. So it's like, what does it look like? What does this kind of co-working look like? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And this is actually an issue I've really been thinking about, the sustainability of co-working and sustainable co-working spaces. And we can tackle that from all kinds of angles. I don't have any answers for these questions. I just know we have to wrestle with them. One of those ways to approach that is the growth of co-working sustainable? I mean, I've seen these projections that say 40% of all professionals will be freelance or 1099. And I start to think about that, and I'm like, 40% of people are all going to have their own lawyer, their own CPA. They're going to do their own. Like at some point, there's a room, and it's a photographer and a designer and a developer and an accountant and a business administrator. And they're like, wait a minute, there's a business efficiency if we come back together. So I've wondered, is it sustainable in the sense of the total potential market? Well, maybe not. It's difficult to tease out. The big one for me in sustainability is, are spaces sustainable when they lose their charismatic founder? And I have not so far, maybe someone can introduce me to one, found a co-working space that transitioned from one charismatic founder. That person has totally left, and a new charismatic leader has come in. And so the space, its culture, its operations, sustained transition. I'm really curious about how that happens. And I'm even willing to put a caveat on that says maybe it shouldn't, right? Maybe co-working communities themselves organically emerge, do a thing, dissipate, and reconfigure. I don't know that, but these are important questions.
Well, that's a really good topic, actually, is the life after the founder, right? And we've had these conversations. And one thing that we're looking at is we have a very passionate core group of members. If I was to die tomorrow, the goal would be that we want to empower those members to, if they are willing and interested, can basically take over. They would then choose to collectively come together as a core. They're basically gifted the whole thing kit and caboodle, the good and the bad. And we have so many really great members who've been part of this now for 11 years. They're just as invested as I am. So how do we give them that kind of co-op-esque model of, ownership? Yeah. And that so maybe it's not in the same vision that I might have had or that the membership of the time had, but maybe it's now this new core group that comes to lead it.
So I'm just generally skeptical that our economy is going to work in 20 years just flat out. So whether or not co-working is a sustainable business model or not, I think is almost playing second fiddle to, the greatest shift in economics that human species has ever endured, right? With AI and automation and just drones and whatever, CRISPR. So you name the technology, it's radically going to disrupt what it means to be a human, let alone a human in an economic system. My thought is that systems like the Candy Factory or Work Hard or Indy Hall can be at the vanguard of testing new mechanisms to make sure people have economic safety nets and are nimble enough to adapt to whatever is coming down the river in the next 15 or 20 years. So we have to just be embracing that idea that we're the vanguard that's going to protect the economy and be able to change to meet the adaptive needs of workers in this modern economy. That's a question. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, it was mentioned during the political panel, a cultural change needs to happen for more of these things to maybe become easier or more impactful or more capital be invested or whatever you want to call it. So in what ways would you see a cultural shift happening? Like, is that education? Is that apprenticeships? Like, what does that look like?
And I think you just said a couple of them. One of the things that I see our work in particular, everyone on this panel and basically everyone I've talked to in this room, in terms of reforming expectations around work where trust and relationships are a priority again. And I think, we endured 100 and 150 years of industrialization where everything was operationalized for scale. And then we're like, sweet, we can do things that are big, but we broke some things along the way. And so we're in a bit of a pendulum swing now where people don't want to give up big, but they also kind of crave some of the stuff we threw out along the way. And so I think of all the ways that our spaces in our communities are laboratories for figuring that out, and then also demonstrating how it translates into success, helping people redefine success, helping people define their own success, I think is really important. And the other thing is we're in this shift where entrepreneurship is super sexy right now. And 10 years ago it wasn't. And 5 or 7 years ago it wasn't. And now, kids want to be entrepreneurs the way they want it to be, a fireman or an astronaut or something like that. And I think there's some things that are cool about that, but there's also some massively misplaced expectations around what it means to be a successful business person. And there's so many people who don't even know that there is an option between having a full-time job working for a company and going to get a bunch of venture capital to start a company to employ hundreds or thousands of people. It's complete, they don't even know it's an option. And so showing people, and I would imagine young people in particular, the breadth of ways that you can make a living doing things that you're good at, how you can continue to develop professionally as we slowly replace all of the things that were built up over 150 years of industrialization. Workplace is just one tiny slice of that stack. Personal professional development, healthcare and infrastructure, the human need of contact and support, and all of those, so many pieces of that. I think the closest clue I have, and again, these are really just clues, is when high school kids or sometimes middle school kids will come in, take a tour, and I can see or hear. These are kids who, up until that point, probably have not seen an adult do things professionally other than what their parents, maybe their parents' friends do. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, they're in a room of 20, 50, 100 people doing things that they never could have imagined were possible. Just showing them that possibility, I think, puts us on a 20-year arc to see people who are more self-aware of their own potential. And I don't actually care what options you choose, just know that there are options.
When I think of sustainability, I don't think so much of financial sustainability or legacy or whatever. I think if I could just get my members to recycle correctly, 100% of the bins of recycling that come out of Cohere are contaminated because I have one member who puts coffee grounds, and I just can't even. So that's what I think about with that. But if I think about like the legacy for Cohere, nothing would bring me more joy than if my daughter wanted to take over Cohere, so her dad has a very traditional W-2 job. He goes to a physical place to do his work, or they send him out in the field to do the job, and he gets overtime and health insurance and all these amazing things. And then she has me, which is like the opposite of all of that. And so the other day I said, I'm not feeling great. I'm not going to go to work today. And she goes, but Mom, we need money. You won't make any money if you don't go to work. And I was like, Eva, even when I'm not at work, it still makes money. And she was like, and I was like, oh my God, I'm teaching my daughter like how to make money even when your body isn't physically present at the thing that you do. But I think in terms of just our industry and the whole revolutionization, which might not be a word, of work, governments and governments will have to figure out how to decouple so much of what they've paired with W-2 employment, because when you think about what you get with a W-2, you often get your health insurance subsidized, you get unemployment insurance, so safety net when your job disappears, you get workers' comp if you hurt yourself on the job. What are the other things you get? It's like who knows what W-2 workers get. They just get so much. And so they're saying 40% of the workforce is going to go contract. It's like, well, that means 40% of the population of America will lose every safety net that Henry Ford put in place for them back in the 20s or whenever that was. And so I really think it's going to be massively painful as we figure out what that shift looks like, because that's the number one pain points for the freelancers and consultants in my space is like, son of a bitch, now I've got to spend $700 a month on health insurance. And I'm sick and now I can't do my contract work, so I'm not going to get paid for 2 weeks. And it's like, how do we build in some of those safety nets for people who are no longer on the W-2?
We have a member who does advocacy work for gig workers. Again, typically the traditional gig workers, so day laborers, et cetera, et cetera. And she and I had a coffee one day, because I was asking her basically like some of those basic things that employees don't even realize are necessarily benefits until they're gone. Things like being able to take a couple days off and still be able to be paid. Is there prior art is basically my question for alternatives for doing this. And there is. Some of them are a little unusual, but I don't think any of them are so outrageous that they couldn't work in any of our individual communities, let alone a collective community. So one of them is essentially, actually they're both essentially the same thing, but they're co-op style. They call it giving circles, I think is the term. And so many of the most popular ones are church-based. So there's a very popular one, I think it's called Samaritan Ministries, where you pay a fixed amount per month based on whether it's an individual or a family. And I think they have two plans, like a basic and then like a platinum or something along those lines. And your first payment out of every 12 months goes to Samaritan Ministries as an operational amount. Every subsequent month, you get a message that says, send a check directly to this other Samaritan Ministries contributor. This month, they're a recipient. This month, they have a need. And they use the church as a way to weed out people based on values or accept people in based on values, which is a pretty clever hack, in my opinion. And they go so far as say you need to get a letter of recommendation from your religious leader, yada, yada, yada. There's really no reason why we couldn't create something like this. It's not a replacement. And they're very clear to say this is not a replacement. This doesn't, there are caps and limits. It doesn't address things like prescription drugs. There's a bunch of things it doesn't cover. But when you're talking about emergency care, and even when it's not like life or death emergency care, but a massive unexpected health expense, those things can potentially be built, which I think that feels resonant. It feels very complicated. It feels like a thing I don't actually personally want to do, but I would happily contribute to. Yeah.
Well, to kind of speak to that and like safety nets. So one of the things that we're lucky to have with Rock Lidditz is access to the Rock Lidditz community and Rock Med, which is an LGH, our local kind of large hospital complex. They basically have created, and Steve, you can probably speak to this a little bit better than I can, but they've created a medical center on the campus, and all of the tenants that are part of the Rock Lidditz community have access to this membership-based medical clinic. And it gives access to be proactive in healthcare. It gives you your regular doctor visits. It gives you even access to prescriptions and basic, I think they'll even do stitches and stuff like that. So like your basic care is covered for like $75 a month. So even if you find yourself in a position where you can't afford the $1,500, some of our members were literally at that, $1,200 to $1,500 a month insurance. It gave them at least the option to have access to good quality health care in the network for a very low membership fee. So maybe while this whole world is changing, it's being creative in some of the safety nets, at least as temporary solutions. But I like that idea of kind of a collective lending circle almost.
I mean, it frustrates me every time a friend has a medical diagnosis and they go to GoFundMe. Like, I mean, I'm simultaneously thankful that tool exists and so pissed off that they have to do that.
Right, sure.
And it's not because I'm not pissed off at they're asking for money or that I have to give them money. Like, just that situation just drives me batty. Yeah.
Well, to bring this back around, because I know we don't have much time left, what are the takeaways from this? What should people know about starting or running a co-working community? What would you say? What is your like, hey, someone's come to you, they're asking you these questions, what's the takeaway? And then we'll open up for some final questions.
I drank a lot of beer, so I had to use the bathroom. Sorry about that. I just wanted to explain that. I felt compelled. The takeaway is don't drink a lot of beer. No, the takeaway is, I don't know. I mean, I think that you've got to spend time not just doing the math of it, right? But really understanding like the culture that you're trying to embed this thing in. And that sounds obvious, but it's actually really hard to do because you don't always get straight answers from people that you're asking questions of. And you can make some choices and decisions that only through time and testing do you discover aren't really indicative or valuable to people that you're trying to serve.
I mean, I guess my takeaway, my like piece of advice to them, of course, go do research first, but would be a question, why do you want to start a co-working space? Do you think this is like the best potential business opportunity that you're going to have? Look, your energy in for money out is easily beat. Like, this is not your best potential business, no matter what. But if a huge part of your motivation is, you see a tremendous social need and you are fulfilled and compensated by that purpose. If a huge part of it is, you see, yourself building out these other ancillary businesses. If you see this as a learning opportunity in how to build a business and how to work in a community meaningfully, how to gain trust, what is your motivation? And I think that's core. It's core to what compels us to keep doing what we do every day and to keep figuring out new models and new ways to build things. That passion is a huge part of the fuel. I think many of us could go make money being paid a W-2 job. But something else attracts us here, and so it's validating. Do you have that something else? Is that what's driving your co-working interest?
Yeah, I think get really specific about who you want to do this with, not for, with. Like my first question every time somebody emails me, I want to start a co-working space. Cool, who's in your community? Oh, I haven't started that yet. Okay, email me back when you have. If you can't give me names of 10 people who want to spend time around each other, not 10 people who want a co-working space. That's very different. 10 people who want to spend time around each other, you're not ready yet. And it's hard work but it's fun work and it's gratifying work. And if you try it and you find that it's not fun or gratifying, then you're going to hate the rest of it. So take that as a very cheap way to learn before you start signing leases and taking out loans and all kinds of other things. You can't avoid that work. You can delay it and pay the price, but you got to do it at some point.
So there are about 40 people in this room right now. Can anybody do math? What is 40% of 40 people? 16? So 16 of you are lonely. Like, you laugh, but it's a true statistic. The Harvard Divinity School did a study, and 40% of Americans are lonely. They don't have a trusted person in their phone that they feel they can call when they need to tell something important to. If you just let that sink in for a second, that's the actual work that we're doing, is we're dismantling loneliness. So it's not about the goddamn desk. And it's not about, the system that you put in place or the co-working software that you use to collect their payment. You're creating these real human connections, and you're solving a pretty gigantic pain for 40% of people. I gave my presentation at Juicy about everything I think is wrong with co-working today. And I didn't talk about my desk. Well, I talked about how shitty my desks are, and how they're from IKEA and they're not expensive. But I did talk about my members and our stories. And everybody in the room was crying. And I guess my takeaway for you is to remember that while this physical space, you talk so much about the physical space and the physical amenities, and people get hung up in that because it's binary. It's a to-do list, it's a checklist. You can say, buy 8 desks, check. Buy 8 chairs, check. Put 8 chairs together, check. And it feels very satisfying, and you feel like you're making progress towards the goal of co-working. But none of that really matters because, as you said, it's a mirage. It's an illusion for the work that you're actually doing, which is helping people make friends. And, maybe, I guess I'll just reshare the story. So knitting group, which was happening in the living room. They always whisper. It's so funny to me. Like, knitting is like this secretive, like, quiet.
Illuminati.
Yeah, it's like they're part of the Knights Templar. But we were in the living room having knitting group, and we were talking, and my member Amy came in, and there was something wrong with her face. And we're like, oh my God, Amy, what's wrong? And she said, my grandma died. And damn it, I'm gonna cry again. Amy didn't go to her desk and hug her desk. She didn't run over to the Unify Wi-Fi access point and say, thank you, Unify, for being here for me today. She came to the living room because that's where the people were. And we hugged her and made her tea and gave her tissues and spruced her up and, got her back to her day. But if she had been at home working that day, she would have had that experience alone. And you think about that, like, you think about what co-working does, and you think about the chance that you give people to connect with one another and get the human resource and the human touch that they need at that poignant moment of their day. Another member who has diabetes came up. He said, I don't feel well. I need help. He lives 40 minutes up a winding road. So if that had happened to him when he was at home, that could have had a very different outcome than him having that experience and coming to one of us in the co-working space and asking for help. So what I want to leave you with is just like a headache from crying, but also just, you can read so much on the internet, and there's so many news stories, mainstream news stories, that just totally miss the fucking point. And I just want you to remember that it's about the people, and it's about creating these poignant connections between two people and being there when they need them the most, so that next time Harvard Divinity School does that survey, it's not 40%, it's like halved. Let's try to move the needle on the percentage of people who feel lonely in America.
That's great. And I would just, to piggyback off of that, doing this now for, long time, like everyone else here, 8 to 10, 11 years and more. And I have to say that for me, if you're not willing to cry and laugh and celebrate successes, but also be a support network for the failures, for the people, this tribe that you've created or that you're bringing together, then you might be in the wrong business, because it's an emotional roller coaster at times, because we become totally vested in the lives of the people that we're surrounded by all the time, which just makes sense, right? You surround yourself with these people, and so you care. And that's where I think the true core of co-working, it's not this building, as great as it is. If it would go away, we've said this, if our buildings go away, our core group, our people, our tribe are still there. We're still there to be there for each other. And I love it, and I have to say that it is hard work. It is the internet is down and people are mad and you're like, oh my God. And there are pain points along the way, and there's gonna be times that you can't solve the problem. Sometimes I've literally been like, well, there you go, it's out of my hands. But my members know that I'm there for them, our team is there for them, we're there for each other, that they're like, okay, I guess I'll go work at home if the internet's down today, but they come back. We were under construction for an entire year. And the majority, we were like, okay, there's gonna be a mass exodus, because who wants to work in a construction zone? Our members worked in a construction zone because they care. And so it's a community, it's a tribe. And I have to just say that I really appreciate all of you here today, and to you guys as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, questions before we go?
Before we take a question, Angel reminded me of a piece of advice that I've been sharing one-on-one with more folks recently, which is stop reading the co-working press. Like, press about other co-working spaces affects you. The effect it has on you rounds to zero. When you have that temptation to go see what WeWork did most recently, go read a press release or a blog post from one of your members. Go find out what's going on in their lives. I've talked to a lot of people who are spending way more time paying attention to what's going on in other co-working spaces than their own. And that's a really, really dangerous habit to get into. Not my circus, not my monkeys is one of my favorite sayings that I was taught. And other people are going to do all kinds of dumb shit that you don't like. Doesn't affect you at all.
So if you want to learn more about an insurance collective for members of co-working spaces, Ashley Proctor in Canada started CoHIP, which is the Canadian Open Health Insurance Plan or something. You can kind of research that process. But then just even recently, I met somebody who works for an insurance company, and she sent me an email out of the blue, and she's like, all right, these guys are ready to offer health insurance to members of co-working spaces. And I'm like, what is this, America? What's happening right now? So it's kind of just opening the dialogue with people who have the power to make that happen. And then the second company to watch, which I'm upset that I still can't talk more intelligently about it, but a guy named Hector started included.co, and he leverages enormous discounts and deals for co-working spaces that are part of included.co that their members in the spaces can access. And if I heard him right, and I hope I did, he somehow gets the vendor to pay for it. So the members, like if you join included.co, you don't pay that membership. When he leverages the deal, he gets the vendor to actually foot the bill. So keep your eye on included.co, because I think he's doing some really magical forward-thinking things for us.
So we've culturally let unions and collective bargaining sort of become demonized and a dirty word, and we need to regain that for the gig economy. I think there's a real opportunity in time, and you see it in the New York folks that are trying to unionize the freelancers and write in legislation that protects them. I think there's a moment now with the economy changing to make a case again for collective bargaining, and I think that can start in these kind of spaces where you have that critical mass of humans that are struggling with economic issues that are burdens on them that are not equitably distributed to other parts of the population.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again for joining us.